I'd just like to welcome everybody to the 8th lecture in our 2021 series. It's the New York History Housing with Frederick. So Frederick's an adjunct professor at the Pratt Institute, and he'll be talking to us today about the history of housing. So after we hear from Frederick tonight, we'll be able to open up for some questions. You can type these into the chat, or feel free to unmute your mic and ask Frederick yourself. So before I pass on, I'd like to say a little bit about ADAS. So we're a student-led society which aims to produce a range of lectures and workshops and social events to students and the wider architecture community. So although we can't be in person this year, this hasn't stopped us, and we've already had people join us from all over the UK and now all over the world, either to listen or speak to our lectures. So tonight I'm excited to get back on with our programme with another excellent speaker on a very exciting and relevant topic. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Frederick.
So thank you, Glenn, and for the invitation to speak. It's been a number of years since I've really had a chance to present my work in this context. So I'm going to take full advantage of it. Well, I've been in practice with my partner, Erica Henricks, in New York City for almost 25 years now. The past 10 have seen research added to the practice as well as the teaching, with most of it for me centered on affordable housing. So my plan today, which is a little twist from your poster, is to dig a bit deeper into the research with what I'm going to call a morality tale, because it lays the groundwork then. And then after that, very briefly, I'm going to touch on a few things from the practice, as well as a few things from my studios at Pratt Institute. So let me share my screen. So here we go. Here's the title. With a subtitle that's been added for today is a morality tale. So Lewis Mumford, the esteemed housing advocate and journalist, contributed a scathing critique for his December 7th, 1935 New Yorker column, coincident with the opening of the New York City Housing Authority's appropriately named First Houses project. There you see an image of the opening on the right. He began by identifying his critical underlying concern that the cost of producing public housing was just not tenable. Focusing on First Houses, he would exclaim, quote, "The cost of renovation is so great that one might as well tear down these lousy quarters and make a fresh start," end quote. The project's fragmentary nature disturbed him. It was quite small, filling only a portion of a single Lower East Side block. In particular, he disagreed with the architect, Frederick Ackerman's subtractive strategy, the demolition of every third building on the site to provide the remaining structures with light, air, and open space. What NYCHA director Langdon Post called the minimum housing requirements of every American, no matter how small his income. Mumford concluded by saying, quote, "First Houses is an overwhelming demonstration of precisely how not to house the lower paid workers, and above all, how not to rebuild the blighted areas of New York." This was quite a statement coming from someone who regarded himself as a close friend of the project's architect and who for 10 years had lived in, enjoyed, and thus appreciated the not dissimilar benefits of another project also designed by Ackerman together with their mutual RPAA colleagues, a project that had embraced and tested many of the same architectural and spatial formulas to be found in First Houses. There you see somebody enjoying those architectural and spatial formulas in the lower right. Mumford wasn't alone in his criticism, however. The cost of the project, caught in the crossfire of new competing agencies, would end up being excessive, considerably higher per square foot than all subsequent NYCHA efforts. Post's initial positive declarations would be overwhelmed by the recriminations as to how the city government saw fit to squander the taxpayers' money. Mumford would be absolutely correct in his premonitions. This was not how the rebuilding of blighted areas of New York was going to be done. First Houses, successful as it would actually prove to be as a model for affordable housing, would from the start and forever after be panned, just as Mumford was doing, as too costly an exercise to ever repeat. Anachronistic is how leading architectural historian Richard Plunz ended up describing it. Looking back, however, I think it's possible to say that this might actually have been public housing's singular opportune moment. 1933 had seen the coming of Franklin Roosevelt and an administration with a social mandate. Legislation had brought about the creation of the New York City Housing Authority. Its board of directors was made up entirely of housing reform advocates. Post was a former tenement house commissioner. Ackerman, appointed to be head of design, had a comprehensive interest in social housing. It was in this role that Ackerman had produced the first houses design and was strategizing with the site planning for what he intended to be the second, third, and fourth houses to follow. With the creation of NYCHA and the appointment of the appropriate people to lead it, it would seem that everything was finally in place for the proliferation of publicly financed affordable housing in New York City. It had the will on the part of a government looking to solve one of its greatest problems. It had the means by marshaling federal, state, and local monies, and it had the method with a superlative body of housing research that had been carried out over the previous 2 decades. For Williamsburg houses, NYCHA's next major development, Ackerman was prescribing what his experience had taught him would achieve a successful affordable housing model. His site plan was an open-ended perimeter block scheme, maybe even a bit boring in its deference to the more radical nature of NYCHA's mission. Williamsburg was going to be 15 times the size of First Houses. It was all on the cusp of realization, an idea that Ackerman had been promoting and working towards since turning his attention to public housing during World War I. But as fate would have it, Williamsburg houses would turn out not to be Ackerman's second houses. It would instead break with the accrued and tested housing expertise that the design group had endorsed and embrace someone and something else more exciting. William Lescaz and his brand of European modernism, who was imagining a wholly different future. Ackerman and everything he stood for would be out. This was an action that in certain ways was a response to Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock's critique from their 1932 International Style exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, that American housing is sometimes an excellent illustration of sociological theory, but seldom an example of sound modern building and never a work of architectural distinction. Williamsburg houses was going to be a work of architectural distinction, and it was also a response to Lewis Mumford and to the cascade of criticism that had rained down on that initial NYCHA project, Ackerman's First Houses. It would be a propitious turning point, because architectural practice would henceforth need to choose between a daring formal style and a socially proven solution, between a disruptive spatial idea and a more conventional one. It was really no choice at all. And so consequently, for effective publicly financed affordable housing in America, that singular moment of opportunity was lost. The early story of social housing in New York City is pretty well known. It begins in the late 19th century with housing reformers working to rectify substandard living conditions and reduce urban squalor. Minimum standards were introduced through building codes to make the interior spaces of multifamily buildings more livable. The New York Tenement Act and Tenement Law of 1901 were initial efforts at reducing block coverage and generating better access to daylight and fresh air. In the early 20th century, philanthropic sponsorship promoted research into alternatives to tenement housing for the working and lower income classes. The architectural invention that emerged from this period was the perimeter block garden apartment. It was simply the result of applying the newer codes for lot coverage restrictions to the larger scale of an entire block. By controlling the block's perimeter, a new amenity, the interior garden court, was able to be introduced. The 1920s would be the period for perimeter block development in New York. A survey of the projects produced by one of its leading practitioners, Andrew Thomas, gives a sense of the variety that an inventive and dedicated architect could produce. Richard Plunz says of the type, "The garden apartment was and still is among the most livable housing in New York. It set a standard for urban housing that has remained unmatched since. The language of the garden was critical to the transformation of housing from a consequence of economic formulas to a unique environment, providing every building with an identity. Despite its success, the philanthropic initiative was of course not an adequate response for the demand for affordable housing. And then with the stock market crash of 1929 and its resulting depression, the problem became a crisis. It would be addressed by Roosevelt's New Deal, but only when the political class came to the recognition that housing should be understood as a basic human right and thus a responsibility of the government itself. The New York City Housing Authority was the agency empowered to manage the federal government's funding and to realize new affordable housing. Its history is really two conjoined stories, and both have been characterized by their quiet successes and loud failures. The first story tells of the struggles of those exceptionally dedicated reformers working with limited funding under a national spotlight to realize long-held aspirations. A national housing bill would be passed, but only by accepting the compromises that distorted its underlying mission. Which begins the second story, how its leadership came to abandon the expertise of its own housing designers in favor of an untested and disruptive urban model, the Tower in the Park superblock housing estate. Consolidated under Robert Moses, NYCHA became an instrument of large-scale urban renewal. Demolition, so-called slum clearance, forcibly destroyed lower middle-class neighborhoods, doing irreparable damage to the lives of the very citizenry that NYCHA had been created to serve. Through it all came an ever-growing, more vertical portfolio of towers. It was the housing type that became as prolific as it was prolifically condemned, ultimately accounting for 2,462 buildings with 176,066 apartments in 326 developments spread over 5 boroughs in a little over 30 years. It is a story that begs a question. How did an entire generation of society's elite, the planners and policymakers, academics, housing specialists, and advocates, allow themselves to abandon a generation of effective housing research and be seduced by what was essentially an anti-urban, anti-social strategy, and even proselytize for something that would end up undermining the qualitative values of urban life? The question is often answered by pointing to the important architectural influence of Le Corbusier's new urban agenda, and in particular his polemical Tower in the Park paradigm. Le Corbusier presented his contemporary city of 3 million at the Salon d'Automne in Paris in 1922. In it, an idealized future was represented with a central business district made up of 24 66-story cruciform towers surrounded by a meandering parkland populated with parallel rows of indented residential slab buildings. It was a provocative tour de force. He represented the scheme along with its adaptation to Paris as the Plan Voisin in his pavilion of the Esprit Nouveau at the Paris Exposition of Decorative Arts in 1925. He would also promote both projects in his quarterly publication, L'Esprit Nouveau, and as a standalone book on urban planning translated as The City of Tomorrow and Its Planning. As a provocation, it catapulted Le Corbusier to recognition, even as it remained, at least for the time, unrealized. In the early 1930s, the new ideas being championed in the United States were less about the tower and more about lower-rise, lower-density projects that had addressed the European housing shortage. Millions had been uprooted and an entire generation lost to World War I. Social trauma had persisted, resulting in rising labor discontent. Affordable housing was a key component for maintaining the stability of a capitalist system, facing a crisis of legitimacy. In America, it would be the Depression that would generate the same post-war-like social trauma and instability. During the 1920s in Europe, modernism blossomed in smaller towns where younger architects found municipal appointments or commissions. Otto Hessler in Kassel, Walter Gropius in Dessau, Bruno and Max Taut, Hans Scharoun, Mies van der Rohe in Berlin under Martin Wagner's public housing program. Thus would mass housing become the program synonymous with modernism. By embracing construction standards, a functional approach to necessary space, and providing an enlarged social program when planning large exurban neighborhoods or Siedlungen, they were solving the principal social problem of the day. Catherine Bauer promoted them in words and images as utopian in her influential book, Modern Housing. This was the landscape surveyed by Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock for their groundbreaking 1932 exhibition, Modern Architecture, International Style, at the new Museum of Modern Art. The exhibit gave the museum an opportunity not just to showcase the research, but to critique American social housing by comparing it unfavorably with what was happening abroad. The criticism was made explicit by presenting an international style proposal by Howe and Lescaz for a site on Manhattan's Lower East Side didactically, side by side, with German architect Otto Hessler's recent Siedlung Rothenburg in Kassel, a perfect example of the Zellenbau planning that Johnson so admired. It was an authoritative display of what was being done in the German suburbs, together with what can be done in the American inner city. The scheme, for which Lescaz later took full credit, was perhaps the most brilliant project of his emerging career. It adapted aspects of the superblock in a rather clever way to the long shape and scale of the site. It introduced New York City to the aesthetics of European-style social housing and anticipated the superblock strategies that would be embraced a few years later. It was a kind of superblock, but in the relationship between built form and open space, it was something of a Trojan horse. What made it so good was that it was still a fully urban project embedded within the gridiron. But with its overreaching vertical presence, it could inaugurate the public to the idea that federally financed housing, then being debated, would not fully integrate into the surrounding city, but stand out and be recognizable as a wholly new identity. The project presented Johnson and Hitchcock's argument for a more intellectual functional style, relocated from the German periphery to the center of the American city. The perimeter block garden apartment and its carefully built body of successful housing research was really dismissed. Johnson and Hitchcock were simply unsympathetic to the broader housing movement in the United States and the implications for architectural values and practice that it represented. As Plunz noted, they were, quote, promoting a moralism grounded in aesthetics rather than social activism, end quote. The irony is that the positive evidence of those broader architectural values had been included in the very same exhibition itself. Because Mumford and Bauer had been able to curate the room on American housing, they had presented Sunnyside Gardens, which is there on the screen on the left, as the model of transcontinental exchange, a project that had managed to adapt European housing principles to American social, economic, and cultural realities. And yet Johnson banished images of Sunnyside Gardens from all publications on the exhibit. Its brick perimeter block form didn't fit his prescribed aesthetic. A comparison of the urban evolution diagrams produced by Gropius on the one hand, which is the upper right, and Stein on the other, which is in the lower right, distills the differences. Gropius concludes with the graphically compelling linear Zellenbau bands, where Stein stops a bit earlier, using a variation of a Sunnyside Gardens perimeter block, stepped and segmented. Gropius's diagram abandons urban context, where Stein's harnesses and reforms it. Yet it was the Gropius diagram that would prove to be more seductive and therefore influential. By 1932, the year of that exhibit, its application was already in the air. Carol Aravanici teamed with William Lescaz to produce what they called a housing demonstration, utilizing an area of Queens to propose the demolition and construction of an entire neighborhood with Zellenbau-aligned housing. Morrison Brune and William Muschenheim the next year proposed something similar for Manhattan, an enormous slum clearance scheme that covered 30 blocks with rows of linear slab housing. Plunz explains the contradiction with transplanting suburban spatial ideas into dense urban contexts. Quote, "The scheme typified the manner in which the new European work came to be misapplied in the United States. The Zellenbau form, which had evolved in Europe as a suburban housing type for relatively low densities, was being applied to vastly different contexts in New York City and suffered from not being able to recognize the physical spatial difference between the two social housing applications. Descriptions of European Siedlungen and New York tenements were interspersed as if the two were interchangeable," end quote. While the European influences were making noise, it was perimeter block projects that were continuing to be realized. Ernest Flagg's Flagg Court in 1933 to 36, Clarence Stein's Hillside Houses from 1935, and Andrew Thomas just kept turning out his signature perimeter block work year after year. Consistent with what was being realized, Ackerman, in his first year at NYCHA, published an analysis of 23 apartment projects for moderate income tenants. Almost every one was a perimeter block garden apartment type. This was really the primer from which the revolution of public housing was intended to emerge. So who is this Frederick Ackerman we have never really heard of? Well, he was in fact a leading voice in the architecture and planning professions throughout the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. One of the few theorists of rationalist architectural discourse in America. And yet, for all of his early prominence and professional success, his voice and influence are almost entirely absent today. Educated at Cornell, and then afterwards in Paris, he began his practice in New York City in 1905 by focusing on housing, city planning, and a progressive social agenda. In 1916, he was sent by the American Institute of Architects to do a survey of the wartime housing and garden city planning being done in England. Upon his return, he was appointed to be head of the U.S. Shipping Board's Emergency Corporation, one of two departments created to provide worker housing for the war industry. Under Ackerman, comprehensive and community-based planning would set up construction, social, and aesthetic standards that his team of architects applied. There are several of the examples of that work on the bottom of the screen. At the war's end, he proposed continuing the program as a peacetime national public housing initiative. It was not, however, an idea the country was yet willing to embrace. He returned to private practice as the recognized housing expert. In 1923, he helped form the RPAA with fellow wartime housing advocates. He collaborated with Stein and Wright on Sunnyside Gardens by designing the architectural fabric, the actual buildings. He partnered with them on their influential Radburn, New Jersey project as well, designing the community buildings. He was ideologically anti-capitalist, perceiving his role as architect first and foremost as a social service. His working method was based on ideas for improving and modernizing the profession, integrating standardization, promoting greater efficiency, expressing form as a direct product of function, and expanding the architect's role into responsible programming. He entirely rejected architectural style as a product of, quote, conspicuous consumption, end quote, a false methodology manipulated and controlled by a demand for profit. The true and necessary evolution of architecture, he felt, could only be achieved with the replacement of the capitalist system itself. During the early years of the Depression, two of Ackerman's associates, Harold Sleeper and Charles Ramsey, initiated a project to document the rationalist methodology of his office as a handbook for the profession. The publication was Architectural Graphic Standards. It was intended as a manifesto, absent of style, and therefore a revolutionary kind of document. Its release happened to coincide with Johnson's International Style exhibition, which Ackerman had summarily rejected as a superficial exercise. It is perhaps emblematic that the book that came to be referred to as the Architect's Bible, and which has sold more than any other book on architecture, and is based entirely on the theory and practice of one man, nowhere mentions or identifies that individual. First Houses The selection of Ackerman to lead NYCHA's new design department had been inspired. He was not only the preeminent affordable housing designer, he was ethically and ideologically motivated by the underlying social mission. First Houses was a very modest foray into the contentious world of federally financed housing. Intended as a tenement renovation project, Ackerman proposed removing every third building to open up the block to light and air. L-shaped along 2 streets, it included a full block of storefront retail space with similar residences above. Entrances were from the side and rear of the buildings from a semi-public garden for shared passive recreation. Stylistically, it was also unique by its virtual elimination of ornament and architectural articulation whatsoever. The absence of architectural detail was consistent with Ackerman's rationalist sensibility. Its architectural generosity was in its use of natural light, air, and common garden space, but with no articulation around the windows and the most minimal reference to the building cornice line, as well as without front entrances, there's absolutely nothing to break the radical monotony of its relentless brown brick walls. The result is a project unique in the annals of New York City's housing portfolio. It is derived from its uncompromised, functionally determinate appearance, together with the integration of well-defined open space. The project holds the street, maintaining a direct and continuous relationship to the surrounding city, and accepts that apartments alone do not make housing, including not only commercial retail program, but a full array of ground floor amenities as well. A nursery, community rooms, a chapel, health clinic, and even storage for baby carriages accessible by a ramp to the basement. In short, it is a superior project not because it stands apart as something different, but because it provides so much more and chooses to disappear back into the city. As Mumford had noted with dissatisfaction, it is incomplete, a fragment of what could be a full perimeter block scheme. To understand this, we need to extrapolate it over the entire block, as you see in the upper right-hand corner. This allows us to visualize it as another sort of manifesto, a perimeter block scheme with a fully defined accessible interior garden, providing nearly 300 apartments organized as 4 one-bedroom units per floor. The gaps between buildings were the result of the original tenement foundations, but any future application of the idea could reconsider those dimensions. But that was not to happen. What would be imitated was Ackerman's more radical banality, his elimination of decorative detail and reduction of the building experience to its massing and composition of punched windows. In Ackerman's hands, this was a more effective rationalism than anything Henry Russell Hitchcock or Philip Johnson had sought. First Houses today can be understood as a precursor fragment to the typological city that Aldo Rossi characterized as embedded within our collective memory. It is adamantly an extension of the city's urban fabric, rendering it, and by extension its inhabitants, anonymous yet fully integrated participants. The Wikipedia entry for First Houses repeats the story that the project was too expensive. It is a story that perhaps explains why such an interesting idea was a dead end and did not become the model for the future of affordable housing. Because it had been intended as a renovation and because the stability of the existing buildings did not stand up to that intention, NYCHA was forced to demolish everything and construct them new. Lower construction costs are always paramount with affordable housing, yet First Houses was of course going to be more expensive. It was too small. It had to re-strategize its construction scope while underway, and it had a low square foot to core ratio. It is not comparable dollar for dollar with the later larger projects. Regardless, the acrimony over cost seems to have turned the perimeter block as a planning type into the baby that got thrown out with the cost overrun bathwater. The perimeter block type would not be introduced again. With First Houses underway, Ackerman had organized an architectural competition for the second project and to select qualified firms to produce future NYCHA efforts as well. Whoops. 277 firms entered the competition with proposals based on his schematic site plan. His intention was to select a corps of talented lieutenants to carry out his executive orders, a replay of his leadership of the Emergency Fleet Corporation, an experience which had brought him into contact with so many other of the foremost thinkers and designers of social housing of the day. 22 qualified firms were selected. And then, just before declaring a winner, the competition was canceled. Instead, the commission was handed to Richmond Shreve, whose firm had recently completed the Empire State Building. He was also president of the AIA, a NYCHA advisory board member, and had been a competition juror. Shreve then did something even more surprising. He hired William Lescaz to be his project designer. Plunz sort of gets to the point. Quote, "The fact that Shreve was chosen indicates that extraordinary influence was brought to bear," end quote. William Lescaz, the man tapped by Shreve to give the project a more modern look, was an architect of enormous ambition who had positioned himself as the face of European modernism in America. He had emigrated from Switzerland after studying with Karl Moser, an early modernist. Starting with nothing but his own assuredness, by the latter part of the decade, he had built a serious architectural practice. Shreve needed Lescaz to give his design team currency, and Lescaz delivered. Taking on Ackerman's site plan, he would defy its integrated effect by modifying the buildings into H and T shapes, rotating them 15 degrees. It proved to be just what was wanted, a gesture of grid-defined bravura, giving the project its desired distinction. Anyone looking for a social, practical, or functional justification for the rotation would come up short. Boilerplate rhetoric about orientation to the sun is frequently cited, but this is not really accurate. Lescaz himself stated that it offered more windows and play space, but the modifications actually subtracted usable outdoor space. The gesture was purely aesthetic. William Palmer's cutting description of Lescaz provides the best understanding of his act. It was characteristic of Lescaz to seek the attention-getting aesthetic effect of a pseudo-Zellenbau system. After all, he had a flair for the bravura effects of modernism as publicity. So it was a project that broke with convention to attract attention to its author and to the project itself. By disengaging from the urban context that surrounded it, Williamsburg Houses declared its indifference and reset the terms of urban intervention. There will be no compromise. The only dialogue was a demand that the surrounding city conform to its new spatial paradigm. But what about the road not taken? First, houses as an affordable housing template. What if Frederick Ackerman's original perimeter block site plan had been adhered to for Williamsburg? Or better still, what if Ackerman's own first houses typology had been recognized for the planning strategy that it was and applied as a template for the future of public housing? His 1934 analysis of projects appropriate as models for future NYCHA housing were almost all perimeter block projects with intermittent breaks between buildings. Ackerman's own portfolio of built works contains two projects that might have pointed to adopting the first houses typology as a standard. In particular, his 1925 design for the Park Slope YMCA on the left is an array of 4 independent 4-story blocks that contain the housing portion of the program, spaced by intermittent open spaces, all of them sitting atop a 3-story plinth that contains the public, athletic, and social spaces. This is effectively what Ackerman would repeat with the commercial portion of the First Houses project. And his 1929 project for the Knickerbocker Village on the right alludes to the alternating rhythm of building an open space by crenellating the plan and indenting between projecting masses to provide for more windows and light. Obviously then, such a spatial idea was very much part of his design vocabulary. If one begins to consider potential variations by manipulating the residual spaces or by indenting the building blocks, its adaptability can be recognized for being well suited to integration with almost any urban condition. Even the unit types designed to be all 1-bedroom apartments can be converted quite easily to combinations of studio, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom units. All in all, it turns out to be a pretty remarkably flexible perimeter block as well as building block scheme. It is radical not just in its reductive appearance, but in its capacity for adaptation. So as an example, we tested the first houses typology against a New York City Housing Authority superblock site. Fort Greene Houses was the largest public housing development in the country when constructed in 1941, requiring the demolition of 22 blocks to generate a setting for 5 superblocks and nearly 3,500 apartments. Mayor LaGuardia called it the most daring housing project ever attempted by this or any other city in the country. And yet only 15 years later, it would be profiled as one of the starkest examples of the failures of public housing. To what degree can this failure be attributed to the architecture and the site planning? In contrast, First Houses has never had these issues. It was able to retain and reinforce a sense of community. Its open spaces are understood to be held in common. The result is that they offer the tenants something more, imparting a sense of generosity, even a dignity to their daily experience, an experience that extends into and engages then with the surrounding city. This was not true at Fort Greene, which, following the Williamsburg model, chose to leave its ample open space undefined and allow its buildings to stand apart from the larger city. Extrapolating the first houses typology over Fort Greene's original 22 blocks reveals that it would have produced an equal number of apartments while adding 27 blocks of commercial retail conveniences and 13 interior gardens, all supported by unique amenities. It would have been a radical project because of its size, of course, but fundamentally banal as basic urban fabric, another indistinguishable part of the city. The affordable housing discourse today has put forward a number of important ideas, integrating different incomes rather than partitioning low-income tenants, eliminating exclusionary zoning to include commercial institutional programming, strategizing job opportunities for residents with the same commercial institutional programs, including socially relevant amenities and community spaces. In short, making affordable housing more a reflection of the city itself and not something that can be distinguished from it. All of these ideas are easily adaptable to, if not already included in, Ackerman's first houses typology. William Lescaze's Williamsburg Houses project was completed in 1938. The actual schism between the pseudo-suburban Siedlung and its fully urbanized context was recognized immediately, but not fully understood. Its aesthetic distinctiveness, its rotation, is what architects fixated on, quickly making it one of the most recognizable and imitated features of public housing. 2 years later would come Queensbridge Houses, then the Vladek Houses on the Lower East Side. The next year would see Kingsborough Houses and East River Houses. In 1942 was Fort Greene, only to be followed post-war by an explosion of demolition, like the Johnson Houses and the Reese and Wald Houses. All were superblock slum clearing efforts. They also all followed Williamsburg's lead. Pushing the linear Zellenbau slabs toward Tower in the Park. Come on, it's not working. There we go. NYCHA never looked back. So what does make urban urban? In his 2009 publication, Public Housing That Worked, Nicholas Bloom provided an in-depth critique of public housing and its perceived failure in the United States. His thesis overturned much of the conventional wisdom and triggered a debate on current housing policy. He claimed that while most of America's public housing was in fact a disaster, New York City's was not. It was New York City's housing authority that had created, overseen, and maintained a product of nearly 2,500 buildings and a system that could and continues to satisfy the housing needs for over 400,000 tenants. In short, it worked. It's a position, however, that only stands up when defining success through the narrow lens of bureaucratic workability. The bottom-up recovery and revitalization of more traditional housing fabric allowed to remain that surrounds superblock housing estates would seem to be a refutation of its own. The surrounding population continues to coexist with public housing superblocks as if they are not even there, circumnavigating them, disregarding them, or just avoiding them completely. For 7.5 million New Yorkers, they remain island wastelands, anti-cities within the city. The opening of Williamsburg houses challenged what it meant to be urban. It inspired Chicago sociologist Louis Wirth to define it more precisely by saying, of course, urbanism included size, density, and heterogeneity, but it was also a specific and unique way of life. To be urban was to experience a set of human interactions that were impersonal rather than intimate. Jane Jacobs had pursued the same idea in The Death and Life of Great American Cities as the, quote, daily ballet, end quote, of the sidewalk, the recurrent and anonymous interactions that make up each person's informal public life. For Jacobs, the informal public life was urbanism as lived, the spontaneous and cumulative experience of the street and sidewalk. Stephen Johnson cites Jacobs specifically for her description of that urban dance. Johnson explains that the city is and always has been more of an emergent than an authoritarian system, evolving bottom up as a constantly mutating multitude of independent and interdependent interactions. He concludes, quote, better sidewalks do make better cities by improving the lives of city dwellers. City life depends on that accidental interaction between strangers that has the potential to influence, to change one's individual behavior, to alter one's perspective. In the case of public housing, first houses had preserved those streets and sidewalks, keeping alive the potential to influence. In nearly every NYCHA project that followed it, the streets and sidewalks were gone. Stephen Kahn's research recontextualized the errors of public housing really as just one part of a consistent and repetitive attack on the city throughout America's 20th century. By identifying such tendencies as anti-urban, he highlights the counterposition, the one that advocates for the qualitative values of urban life. And while it is perhaps too late to resurrect Frederick Ackerman's original first houses typology, it is not too late to ask, what can we do about resolving the disruption of NYCHA's vast urban planning legacy, those nearly 2,500 buildings on over 300 sites? With the housing authority now insolvent and failing, perhaps we have to ask it. Kahn's concluding sentence laid down the challenge. The problem of the 21st century will be how we re-urbanize, that is, how we fix the mistakes of our anti-urban 20th century. In proposing solutions to this question, we can perhaps see that architectural practice might get a second chance to identify itself, like Frederick Ackerman, with a moral position grounded in social activism rather than aesthetics. So that is my morality tale, which reframes the disaster of public housing not as an accident, but the result of a sequence of clear-eyed choices that upset a course of action that intended to or would have put us in a very different place today. So all I can say is that perhaps greater awareness might open up the possibility about doing something about it or them, which then brings me to another question, which challenges my last statement. So is it really too late to apply that Ackermann typology. I think as architects, we like to discuss affordable housing as a design issue, at least in architectural schools. And as a designer, I'm always curious to know what any challenge is going to bring. But it seems to me housing, and in particular affordable housing, might be more about applying formulas. Access to light, single, double, triple sides, horizontal versus vertical circulation, the number of stories. Are we talking low rise? Are we talking something taller? And with the application of formulas comes the question of identity and visibility. Affordable housing might be a program that demands anonymity to be a part of the urban fabric without standing out from it. Design today wants to be anything but anonymous. Design wants to be distinctive. So can it be both? So this is where I'm going to show you a few things from my studio, professional studio. We submitted, not too, in the recent past, there was a San Francisco Affordable Housing Challenge. In fact, I just inserted this word of demonstration because I think ultimately the idea of entering the competition was not so much that we felt that we had, a scheme to win the competition. It was more of an experiment and an attempt to answer the previous question as to whether or not it is too late for Ackermann's first houses typology. So we entered with a statement that affordable housing is no longer a design issue. It is an issue of political responsibility. If housing is to be a human right, then federal, state, and city budgets need to be prioritized for it to be built. So what we did was that we started with an upgrade of Ackermann's work to make it more environmentally appropriate. We employed mass timber as a structural technology, which, by the way, adapts itself as a substitute for concrete housing construction quite seamlessly. We added solar roof arrays. We kept the 50-foot street frontages alternating with 25-foot open gaps. But thinking back to that slide with the sort of adaptability of the scheme, this is really what we wanted to test out. We also anticipated a wider diversity of apartment sizes and utilized the second floor open roofs on the commercial spaces by linking them to amenities. And then we looked at San Francisco and somewhat arbitrarily identified several centralized locations with different underdeveloped block conditions and applied the template. So this is what we got. For North Beach, we had a full empty block and a half block, a bit like the original first houses. And this seemed to adapt pretty easily to both of these sites. In one of the Soma neighborhoods, we were looking for something that would be a little more fragmentary, so that we could use the system as a kind of infill. And that's what we found here, sort of integrating together with other existing buildings. And then for the last site, we wanted to test out an irregular block, something that was perhaps triangulated. Is the system flexible enough to apply to that as well? And sure enough, I think it was. So needless to say, we didn't get very far with the competition, which I suppose is to be expected if you enter a design competition and declare that it's not about design. So we tried it again, this time for the Melbourne Housing Challenge, a second demonstration. So for the Melbourne Challenge, we toned down the rhetoric and generated a slightly more designed look for our starting template, but it really is an application of the same formula, which is to say we remain fully in debt to Frederick Ackermann. And then we attempted to identify sites in Melbourne, which proved to be much more challenging because overall it's a lower, flatter city than San Francisco and incredibly dense, very little open space available, except for one thing, of course. It's public housing superblocks. In spite of the well-known international failures of Tower in the Park modernism and the success of its own low-rise, high-density housing, the Victorian State Government's Housing Commission between 1964 and 1970 cleared 28 sites across inner Melbourne for the development of 47 20 to 30-story high-rise housing blocks situated in unadorned landscape. So we thought those superblock sites might be our opportunity. First, as it's publicly owned land, one of the principal economic obstacles could be identified. And second, desuburbanizing the sites with new infill affordable housing might better integrate the towers with their surrounding neighborhoods. So our proposal was to develop all 28 sites, but we presented just 4. So like San Francisco, each had its unique differences. For the Collingwood estate, it required us to introduce 2 new streets and kind of to return or reblock the site in a way that was not exactly the same, but similar to its sort of original grid. And then the Ackerman overlay sort of works together with the existing S-shaped towers on 2 of the 3 blocks. And at the Fitzroy estate, we subdivided the super block into 2 new blocks with 2 S-shaped towers that could work together with the Ackerman elements to form perimeters and internal gardens. At the Richmond estate, we had 4 different blocks. And then in North Melbourne, this is our single triangulated site. We mediated between the block's boundary and the standalone towers. So I think what was important for both of these was really plausibility. Both proposals seem to suggest that if one was interested in developing a low-rise, mostly prefabricatable, environmentally responsible, affordable housing, that it could respond to a wide set of possibilities, then in fact it could work. But the Ackerman typology also seemed to work best when attempting to restore urban fabric. That would be the San Francisco version. For the Melbourne challenge of mediating towers with low-rise surrounding fabric, probably a few more tools would be best. And that's going to take me to my last question, which goes back to the end of the morality tale. What can we really do about resolving NYCHA, those 2,500 buildings on 300 sites? This is the challenge I've been offering with my Pratt Institute design studios for the past 5 years. It's a studio that begins by suggesting perhaps the superblock is simply unfinished. And if so, then how might it be possible to add to it to fill in the undefined residual space in such a way that it can re-urbanize and restore its interconnectedness with the fabric that surrounds it? It's typically a 2-step process. These are 4 of the sites that we've used. The first step is to restore the idea of the street. The superblock eliminated not only the actual streets, but the very idea of the street, the spatial presence that frames the collective activity of an urban neighborhood. By restreeting the superblock, you can open an opportunity to restore that collective activity. And then the second step is to reshape the urban fabric in response to the altered street pattern. By introducing a lower rise, typically, infill architecture to shape the residual space, specifically the towers will disappear into a new block's figured ground. Reshaping and giving definition to the new fabric is what allows urban continuity to be recovered. So what's actually been interesting is that after doing these studios, selecting different sites, having different studio groups over a period of 5 years, we've produced maybe 50 different projects. And what's happened is a distinct set of urban typologies has begun to emerge as to how to handle superblock sites in spite of all of their differences. And so here's a few of these. The microblock. Kind of an obvious solution, really, because it identifies each of the NYCHA buildings. There you see the Ingersoll-Whitman, the one that we use as our test case. It identifies each individual building as being the centerpiece for a new block, as you see on the right. And then depending on the sort of pattern or organizational conditions of the original NYCHA project, you end up with results that can be somewhat organic, as in the Ingersoll-Whitman, or quite familiar in the Farragut, as you see with the Farragut houses. Whoops, went a little too far. Let me go back here. Perimeter block. The perimeter block is the most pedagogically driven solution. It's about determining ways to link existing buildings together into new aggregated blocks and then resolving the interior courts as either private or public spaces. You see two different variations there. And then the replicating block, which I call it that because the new fabric attempts to replicate aspects of the existing NYCHA building forms and ultimately then resolve or project really quite interesting solutions. The metastasized block is a fourth type, which tends toward greater spatial intensity because it links all the parts together. The result is something more labyrinthine. And then lastly, is just called the freestyle block because it's sort of non-categorizable. But the other thing that comes out of this is the realization that this is such an incredible opportunity right now that, you know, this very real NYCHA crisis presents, and it really shouldn't be underestimated because we really have a chance to infill the tabula rasa of open space cleared by perhaps the greatest public works project in the history. I mean, this is an opportunity for our century, an opportunity not just to fix the mistakes, but to redefine the future city. And as I think all of these schemes communicate the possibility of generating new urban identities while simultaneously making our cities whole again, is certainly within our grasp. So that's what I have for you this evening, which is a backstory that led to a speculation on what might have been a more ethical and less polarized city. And then what I hope are two provocations that suggest it is something that might still be achieved. So thanks for having me.
That's brilliant. Thank you for coming along tonight, Frederick. It was brilliant to hear from you. So I'd like to open up for questions now. So if you'd like to ask any questions, then feel free to type them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll pick up on them. So we'll give you some time to do that. But I'd like to ask personally, so you mentioned the use of mass timber within your studio groups. How widely is mass timber sort of used within New York, and how is it accepted?
Well, it hasn't been accepted for New York City as of yet. There's an anticipation within the next few years that it will begin to be integrated. There are certain cities in Western United States that has sort of jumped ahead and opened up development of mass timber. The Northwest, Portland and Seattle, of course. New York City is a bit resistant. You know, it has a sort of heavy sort of concrete interest. I mean, there's a number of different obstacles to get it opened up. But with a colleague at Pratt, we were involved in a studio 2 summers ago that interestingly selected a series of seminal early modern housing projects, all of which, of course, were concrete, and did a study to see how well mass timber might sort of integrate or be used in lieu of that. And it turns out that because housing it was really built around a kind of interior dimension of about 12 feet, as a kind of typical room dimension. It turns out that mass timber, which also has that same limitation in terms of its spanning, works pretty perfectly, actually. This is another paper that needs to be written, the sort of perfect substitution of mass timber for concrete in housing.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like it's almost the next big thing. I've had a question come in saying, do you think that this typology, I assume that she's referring to the Ackermann typology, could work more in European scale cities, or do you think it's more relevant for mass cities in North America?
Well, the thing that's unique about the Ackermann typology is the open gaps, right? It's not a continuous perimeter. It has these series of breaks. And the proportioning of the original project was really set because of the fact that it was supposed to be a renovation project. There were existing tenement buildings on the site, and the way it was structured, by being a renovation, the kind of incredibly inventive solution was to remove every third building. And so that left a relatively wide dimension, it's 25 feet between the buildings. And so that's both, I think it's kind of uniqueness, but it's also something that, as I alluded to, is no longer a requirement when you're starting from scratch. Yeah. There are other studies that suggest the dimension of 16 feet is more appropriate as a kind of gap between buildings. And so, given the flexibility of the system, I think yes. The answer to that is yes. I don't think this is a kind of uniquely American idea. In fact, you can look at projects by Aldo Rossi or some of the other Italian rationalists, which in fact look very similar already. So, and I think it should be obvious that the graphics in the representation of the first houses scheme are intended to be another kind of provocation. Like, well, if we had looked at Ackermann's work more as Aldo Rossi had looked at his own work, would we see it in very different ways? So you'd have to tell me if, in fact, it's more effective that way.
So Matthew Thomas has asked, do you feel that the United States will ever undertake such a large-scale state-funded housing program again?
I'm not that enthusiastic about it. It would be taking on public housing with the same sort of initiative and energy that it was taken on originally. It would take that kind of scale of investment, and yet as I say that, the city is in fact engaged in a kind of fragment of that idea, right? They have created this thing called NYCHA 2.0, and they are reducing the number of buildings that they're responsible for. They are selling air rights on certain sites, and then they are, quote, developing certain other sites. But they're not going about it in a comprehensive way. They're going about it in a very piecemeal way. They're inserting a single building on a parking lot that ultimately then doesn't have a transformational effect. And, trying to open up awareness that what a remarkable opportunity this is. Urbanistically, all of these projects are total disasters, and yet you could turn them into sort of really fantastic things. But there's so many forces at play. There's so many different participants. There's I guess I'm more of a glass half empty kind of person.
Aren't we all? Aren't we all?
So it's hard to anticipate that, but
Yeah, of course.
who knows?
Well, it's something to look forward to, I suppose. So Adam has asked if you can talk a bit more about what you consider as a matter of design versus an application of formula. So where does that leave the designer or architect if those formula are created, and is there a solid definable boundary between the two problems?
Well, when I say for me, housing, and particularly affordable housing, right? There's so much work that has transpired in the last 100 years with housing, and I think like for all the studios that we teach at Pratt, between the core studios, the learning studios, and the advanced studios, the one housing related studio that's taught, that's the one where precedent is, I think, most importantly applied, right? It really becomes a kind of integral part of what you're doing. You really can't do housing without knowing housing, without looking at other housing, right? And if you're looking at other housing, then you're attempting to borrow best practices and apply those best practices to what you're doing, right? And so that's really where I'm kind of thinking in terms of this application, systems, as opposed to sort of inventive design. The Melbourne Housing Challenge, by the way, the Melbourne Affordable Housing Challenge, they just announced the winners last week, and hey, one of the schemes I thought, oh, that's very interesting, that's fantastic, which was the sort of linear structure over the rail yards. Yes, great, but it introduces this degree of ambition, which affordable housing always shies away from, right? Affordable housing, for some reason, the term affordable gets applied. It's like it has to be affordable. It has to be less expensive. I started the paper with Mumford's. We can't afford to build, affordable housing. We can't afford it. But why not? The United States spends a little too much money on its defense budget. We could deflect a little of that money, and I think we could create a different future.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had another question. Is there a maximum size or capacity that you would recommend? Is there a development ever too big?
Yes, that's an interesting question. The application of the Ackerman typology, the work that we did in the application of the Ackerman typology to the various sites within the city was done in an extremely straightforward way. We didn't approach it with too much creativity. It was really a kind of a one-to-one application. And yet a lot of those smaller blocks where you had, say, 6 blocks originally that had been combined into a single super block are much more, let's say, comprehensively understandable as making sense. Whereas when you see it applied to that original, Ingersoll Whitman or Fort Greene houses project, which had 3,500 apartments and 22 blocks that had been demolished into 5. That's pretty.
Heavy.
That's a pretty relentless application. And so, in the same way that, the Ingersoll Whitman project today didn't use one architect to create that project. It used a whole array of architects. It used many different architects, and there are, they're not so easily recognizable at the scale that I showed the image of the plan, but in person there are these minor differences and changes, and they're subtle, more subtle differences, and I would think that's what would make the system much more amenable, is that you don't have a single architect laying out 3,500 units. you actually break it up and you offer it out to a number of different architects, and then they interpret that. They interpret this typology in ways that begin to have subtle differences, changes of materials, other things begin to sort of play into it. It's really more of a larger idea. And in that sense, I think it would be okay. So no limit.
Perfect. I've had a question from Lawrence as well. Well, I don't know, it's a bit of an observation he's saying. So he says, what a great lecture, great graphics. He says, it's time for us all to come to New York. Maybe a couple of months too early, but not a question, just an observation. It looks like the first houses harks back to Jeffersonian UVA planning aesthetic. Am I right about that? Some of the NYCHA housing must be reaching the end of their lives, so perhaps a strategy for phased replacement.
The connection to UVA, is that his point?
Yes, I think so. Connecting back to Jefferson UVA planning.
I never thought of that. I never thought of that connection. I mean, it's I think it's more coincidence, actually, that link. You know, the Jefferson, the University of Virginia Jeffersonian plan is one that, number one, it topologically shifts in section, and was always understood to be an open-ended system, with the landscape being the subject, right? The land, it was framing a kind of landscape condition, and then it steps down into that landscape. Of course, as the campus then grew and became more urbanized, it got capped off. But no, I think this whole perimeter block thing, really, as I said earlier, is literally the application of zoning, which required rear yards on the lots. You know, the typical lot in New York is 20 feet wide and 100 feet deep, and it runs back to back with another lot for a 200-foot wide block. And so once you input the open rear yard to allow for light to access the back of a building, and then you multiply that times all of the individual lots over an entire 200 by 600 or 200 by 800 foot block, that's what you get. Yeah. Right? That's what you get. And the idea of, you know, the kind of clever idea of demolition, which is the first houses thing that makes the first houses distinctive, I suppose then draws a connection to the pavilions at the University of Virginia. But I think it's more coincidence than anything else, right? Or it speaks to the universality of that idea, right? The sort of framing of open space in a particularly, you know, coherent way.
Yeah, definitely. Trying to create that sort of positive outdoor space.
Yeah, yeah.
So open up to any last questions that we've got coming in. So if you've got anything else you want to ask, fire it in just now. But another one for myself. So is there any cities or typologies other than the sort of Ackerman typology that you think that that New York could potentially learn from?
What was the end of the question exactly?
Is there any other sort of typologies other than, or cities that New York could learn from?
Well, I think that's what the whole sort of body of work at the end was intended to explain, right? That like when we set up that studio initially, I really had no idea what would come out of it. Yeah. I wasn't, I mean, we did set up one little trick, which was that we allowed students to build up against the existing buildings, which meant that it had to be a project sort of by the owners of those buildings, because they were effectively then additions to those buildings. But by doing that, by not requiring, let's say, a 30-foot space between a piece of new fabric and the existing buildings, it really kind of opened up what was possible on these sites to all kinds of things, as you hopefully saw in those different categories that I had. But what became interesting over time is how students, without any prompting, gravitated toward these different strategies on how to handle the site. It's really an incredibly rich body of material. I'm just, I've been doing a lot of posting now on my Instagram site of my 50-year collection of slides, right, from traveling around, and I've been posting all this stuff, and I just hashtag it. I love cities. It's like I love cities, and that's what these projects are communicating, right? These are projects that talk about loving cities, right? Creating urban spaces that are kind of uniquely different and fantastic. And wow, that's and the fact that they can be categorized into different typologies just makes it even more interesting. Yeah. Because then the actual site is the thing that begins to sort of integrate and generate differences from it. So yes, absolutely.
We've had one last question come in before we finish up tonight. Is this a problem that you pose to your students every year? And is there any solutions in particular that surprised you the most?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the last part again.
Is there any solutions in particular that have surprised you the most?
Yes, there was one in particular. It was in the last slide, and it was a grid of its own that had been overlaid onto the site, and it was an incredibly brutalist scheme because the grid that the student had put down had an open piloteed ground and only 2 floors of housing above it. And it didn't really transform the towers. It in fact encapsulated them. It captured a tower in an open courtyard. And so the courtyard couldn't perform as a courtyard because it had the tower in the middle of it or offset within the middle of it. And, I found it a somewhat haunting scheme because it obviously transformed the site, but it transformed it in a way that sort of reimagined it quite differently from what I sort of had in mind when I set up the problem. And so that one's, if Jason Kim is watching, that was his skin. That was really a fantastic invention.
We've had one more come in. So from Joshua Barnett. Great presentation. I really like the design solutions. Is there the Green New Deal for public house? There is the Green New Deal for public housing, but it focuses on sustainable design and funding more than these kind of livability issues. Are these the kinds of design questions that are getting traction within the public housing advocates?
Well, yes, because the other thing that's happening, even though the work that I'm doing within the studios is showing how the sort of urban problem of the public housing sites is really what we're addressing. The New York City Housing Authority is currently, they have another problem, right? Which is that all of their projects had a 50-year lifespan and they're all over 50 years old, which means they need to practically rebuild them again anyway. And, which is, they've identified $34 billion is how much money they need to just preserve what's there, And so obviously, if you're going to invest $34 billion, you have to do it in a way that at least transforms things environmentally. They have to take advantage of this, of different systems. They have to sort of redo the skins. They have, there's so much that they can do now. They can become models in a way for green building as a result of doing that. I just wish it would be a way to also address the sort of urban problems that these projects present.
Yeah. Perfect. I think that's where we'll have to finish up tonight. We ran over a wee bit, but it's okay because I'm sure everybody's enjoyed themselves tonight. So thanks everyone for turning up. Thanks Frederick for joining us. I know it's sort of middle of the day for you, so we'll let you get back to it. But for anyone who's looking to join us next week, we'll be joined by Charlie Koolhaas, who is a Dutch photographer and writer. So she'll be speaking to us about her new book, City Lust. So hope you can all join us for that. So thanks everybody for coming along tonight, and hope to see you again soon.
All right. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you.